Добрый день. Начинаем наш еженедельный брифинг с онлайн-подключением российских и зарубежных журналистов. Итак, традиция, начинаем с графика министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации Сергея Викторовича Лаврова. С 12 по 13 ноября в Пномпене, это Камбоджа, министр иностранных дел России Сергей Лавров примет участие в 17-м Восточно-Азиатском саммите. Российская сторона традиционно, как вы знаете, рассматривает эту площадку как важный элемент многополярной архитектуры региональной безопасности, обладающей потенциалом развития взаимополезного, многостороннего практического сотрудничества. В ходе мероприятий этого саммита считаем важным подробно обсудить те вызовы, с которыми сегодня сталкивается Азиатско-Тихоокеанский регион. Ключевой из них – предпринимаемые Соединенными Штатами Америки и их союзниками попытки разбалансировки сложившейся здесь системы межгосударственных отношений, стремление привнести в Азию конфронтационный заряд таких узкоблоковых инструментов доминирования, в том числе путем торпедирования работы существующих общерегиональных механизмов и одновременного запуска всевозможных неинклюзивных, так называемых индотихоокеанских проектов. Опасные тенденции мы также видим в том, что в регион буквально заводится военная и военно-технологическая инфраструктура НАТО. И также, конечно, опасность кроется и в сращивании этой инфраструктуры с силовым потенциалом союзников Вашингтона, в том числе по линии блока AUKUS. Напомню, это США, Британия, Австралия. Россия неизменно выступает за то, чтобы Восточно-Азиатский саммит занимался решением конкретных, актуальных для каждой, без исключения стран АТР, задач развития. Этот подход лежит в основе всех наших инициатив на так называемом ВАСовском столе, Восточно-Азиатские саммиты, так сокращенно называются, находятся российские предложения о запуске механизма коллективного реагирования на пандемические угрозы на основе принятого в 2020 году профильного заявления ВАС. Мы также выдвинули идею использования потенциала туристической отрасли для совместного поиска путей экономического восстановления стран-участниц. Хорошая основа для этого заложена и в соответствующем заявлении лидеров 2021 года. Следующий шаг – проведение встречи руководителей туристических ведомств. Не можем, конечно, обойти стороной такую социально значимую тему, как волонтерство. В период пандемии новой коронавирусной инфекции добровольцы как в России, так и в Юго-Восточной Азии сыграли незаменимую роль в помощи гражданскому населению, смягчению тяжелых ситуаций, в которых оказались люди. И Ассоциация государств Юго-Восточной Азии, АСЕАН, то есть это ядро ВАС, уже выразила поддержку российским предложениям о налаживании взаимодействия между волонтерскими движениями стран-участниц форума. Мы приветствуем интерес АСЕАН к развитию взаимодействия с другими конструктивно настроенными объединениями евразийского пространства и поддерживаем приглашение на асеановские мероприятия в Пномпене генерального секретаря ШОС, Шанхайской организации сотрудничества, Джан Мина. Контакты АСЕАН с этой структурой позволяют заложить основу для выстраивания широкого континентального сотрудничества, которое направлено на достижение устойчивого развития, благополучия и процветания наших стран. Также я хотела бы обратить внимание на то, что изменилась дата проведения 39-го заседания Совета глав субъектов Российской Федерации при Министерстве иностранных дел России под председательством министра иностранных дел нашей страны Сергея Лаврова. Оно пройдет 18 ноября, там же в особняке Министерства иностранных дел. Напомню, что в нем примут участие губернаторы, руководящие сотрудники администрации президента Российской Федерации, федеральных органов исполнительной власти. Главная тема повестки дня – особенности международного межрегионального сотрудничества субъектов Федерации в условиях новой геополитической обстановки. Не буду заново зачитывать и напоминать о тех основных тезисах, которые мы уже опубликовали, в том числе сделали на прошлом брифинге. Ссылку мы обязательно поставим на эти материалы в тексте сегодняшнего брифинга. Итак, переходим. Да, хотела бы также сказать, что в графике главы Российского внешнеполитического ведомства возможны дополнения, изменения, о которых мы будем вас, как и всегда, оперативно информировать. Итак, переходим к актуальной международной повестке. Об украинском кризисе, конечно, нужно сказать в первую очередь, несмотря на то, что в последнее время в западных средствах массовой информации активно продвигаются тезисы о необходимости возобновления переговоров по мирному урегулированию украинского кризиса, власти США, Канады, стран Западной Европы делают все, чтобы максимально затянуть боевые действия. Как они это делают? Они накачивают Украину оружием, собственным оружием, разным оружием. 4 ноября помощник президента США по национальной безопасности Джон Салливан, который находился в Киеве, подтвердил выделение Вашингтоном очередного транша военной помощи на $400 миллионов. В него войдут свыше 1000 дронов «Камикадзе», 250 бронемашин, 40 ручных бронекатеров, а также впервые тяжелая бронетехника. 45 модернизированных танков Т-72. Общий объем официально анонсированного с начала специальной военной операции военного содействия Вашингтона Киеву достигает 18 миллиардов долларов, даже больше. 18 миллиардов 200 миллионов. Это только из того, что было официально объявлено. Как мы не раз говорили, далеко не вся военная помощь используется по назначению. Значительная ее часть возвращается в Европу и попадает в руки террористов, преступников, а также идет в различные конфликтные зоны по всему миру. Вначале мы об этом говорили как о предостережении, сейчас мы об этом говорим как о свершившемся факте. Об этом начинают говорить сами европейцы, их средства массовой информации, журналисты, представители общественности и, конечно, правоохранительные органы. 7 ноября на Украину отправилась группа американских экспертов для проверки поставок военной помощи Киеву. Как вы думаете, что же выяснилось? Соединенные Штаты контролировали лишь 1/10 ее часть, или 22 тысячи единиц вооружений. Судьба остальной части поставленного оружия неизвестна. Вообще, представляете, что происходит? Обращают на себя внимание масштабы общественных протестов в странах Европы, многотысячные участники которых выступают против оружейных поставок Киеву. Здесь все. Здесь и просто конъюнктура момента, и забота о собственной зоне безопасности, нежелание делиться ни с кем, ничем, просто потому что им самим сейчас нужнее, и понимание колоссальных пагубных последствий. И здесь уже речь идет не о узкокорыстных интересах, сколько действительно, наверное, о анализе того, что ждет наш континент, да и в целом наш мир, если такими темпами этот конфликт будет с Западом разжигаться. Все эти демонстрации также свидетельствуют о том, что европейские граждане не хотят войны, не хотят воевать с Россией и не хотят за это все платить. Их беспокоит, что, несмотря на экономические трудности, руководство Евросоюза заявляет о готовности выделять Украине по 1,5 миллиарда евро в месяц. И делать это, как заявляют некоторые деятели в Брюсселе, столько, сколько потребуется. Напомню, общая сумма спонсирования за текущий год составит 18 миллиардов евро. 2 ноября Россия возобновила участие, как вы знаете, в договоренностях по вывозу зерна из украинских портов после получения при посредничестве Турции письменных гарантий Киева о неиспользовании гуманитарного коридора в военных целях. Мы надеемся, что режим Зеленского будет выполнять эти гарантии лучше, чем Минские соглашения. И сожалеем, что по-прежнему нет прогресса по российской части Черноморской сделки. Напомню, она была пакетной. Именно так ее предложил, так ее видел и, надеюсь, видит до сих пор генеральный секретарь Организации Объединенных Наций. США и ЕС продолжают чинить препятствия выходу наших удобрений и агропродукции на мировые рынки. Будем это учитывать при рассмотрении вопроса о целесообразности продления зерновой сделки. И я хотела бы, собственно, этим и предварить многочисленные вопросы, которые нам поступают. А что будет с сделкой? Будет сделкой то, что будет с российской частью этой сделки сейчас. принципе, до окончания срока, на который она была заключена, остается не так много времени, буквально считанные дни. Мы еще раз констатируем, что российская часть этой сделки выполняется с такими сбоями, что это выполнение нельзя считать полноценным. Хотели бы еще раз напомнить о предложении нашей страны бесплатно передать нуждающимся странам порядка 300 тысяч тонн российских удобрений и безвозмездно поставить им до 500 тысяч тонн зерновых. Ситуация, когда западные компании-перекупщики вывозят с территории Украины зерно, не заботясь о потребностях самих украинцев, напоминает, конечно, трагические события 90-летней давности. Многие историки видят в этом явные параллели, и я не могу сейчас о них не сказать. Именно с опорой на мнение большого количества публицистов, людей, которые занимались этими вопросами, с опорой на документы. Вот тогда, в 30-е годы прошлого века, в условиях многолетних неурожаев и голода в Советском Союзе, западные страны, рассчитывая, что Советский Союз откажется от планов по индустриализации, не принимали от Советской России в счет оплаты за станки и оборудование ничего, кроме зерна. Тем самым они во многом стали ответственными за то, что получило название, что вообще привело к голоду, а в целом ряде республик, ныне суверенных стран, называется голодомором. И на самом деле голод-то был на значительной части территории Советского Союза, включая Украинскую ССР, Урал, Северный Кавказ, Поволжье, Казахскую ССР, Западную Сибирь. В политических целях об этом сейчас...
The Ukrainian SSR, the Urals, the North Caucasus, the Volga region, Western Siberia. But right now they do not remember about these facts, and only one country has the right to believe that it is a victim, it is a victim of famine or artificial creation of famine, and the West, I don't know why, but the West believes that this victim is Ukraine only. But I would like to remind you that a lot of people living in the Soviet Union, they also died because of this hunger, because of this problem. So we should know our history. We should overcome this political situation. So this situation shouldn't prevail over historical memory. Right now I'm talking about the West. And we do it consciously. And right now the West is trying to use food as a tool of pressure. Isn't it so? I would like to remind you what we stated publicly, and we presented all the facts, our arguments, and they were British experts who were behind the preparation of these Ukrainian forces who had carried out a terrorist attack in the Black Sea through the humanitarian corridor. At the end of November, Ukraine will commemorate the next anniversary of famine, and they are trying to equate it with genocide. But we recommend Kiev to carefully study the documents and see the notorious role of its Western masters in the creation of this famine. Continuing with the historical topic, I would like to draw your attention to the fact how the Kiev regime is continuing to demolish its monuments, the monuments of our common history. All the monuments of the Soviet period have already been dismantled, including those to Lenin, whose Ukraine owns its statehood. And on the 7th of November, Odessa announced the dismantling of the monument to Catherine II, who found this city. How should we call these people who dismantle monuments? And they do so not for the first time. They dismantle the monuments to those who founded the city. So it is so surprising that by implementing the dismantling of these monuments, they at the same time declare their commitment to decolonization. And that is when they dismantle the monument to Catherine II. They repeat the same steps, the same actions taken by communists they hated so much 100 years ago. You can read Bunin and his masterpieces. He described the events of those years, what was going on with this monument. If you will read, if you read this masterpiece, you will see what is going on in Odessa right now, because it looks like that. And at the same time, neo-Nazis have constantly defiled the monument to the field marshal, Mr. Alexander Suvorov. And I do not understand why. Why he's guilty? Because he wasn't an emperor. I believe that there should be some ideological sense that underpins this decision. But the neo-nationalist regime in Kiev is quite concerned with the fact that their history cannot be separated from the Russian history, because we have the common history at all. And the gross violation, I would like to say that it is a terrorism, are attempts of the Ukrainian armed forces to use MLRS and the use of prohibited anti-personnel mines, battle mines, against civilians. And we demonstrated some fragments of these battle mines. It was the permanent representatives of Russia to the UN, Mr. Nebenzia. These dangerous devices are spread using cluster munitions on the streets of Russian towns in Donbass. In the DPR alone, they have injured more than 80 civilians, including 4 children. I would like to stress that the use of battle mines is a violation of the 1997 Ottawa Convention on the prohibition of anti-personnel mines, as well as the second protocol of the Geneva Protocol on conventional weapons, which prohibits mines without self-destructors. So we are outraged that the DPR leadership's numerous appeals to the International Criminal Court remains unanswered. The Westerners' reliance on the ICC in Ukraine is an example of selective or politicized justice, or the lack of justice at all. The refusal of the ICC to consider numerous evidences of war crimes by Kiev and Donbass submitted to his office by the DPR authorities, as well as by victims and human rights organizations, is another evidence. For long 8 years, we have waited in vain for the fight against impunity in Ukraine. And we cannot expect justice from the ICC and a number of other politicized international institutions. And another topic in the context of the situation in Ukraine, we believe that the decision made by Bulgarian authorities to provide military and military technical assistance to Ukraine is another unfriendly attack on our country that will lead to further degradation of deplorable bilateral relations. Right now, the responsibility for protraction and escalation of the conflict among civilians, the disruption of civil infrastructure, as well as undermining of the security in Europe falls on Sofia as well, and we believe that the Ukrainian lawmakers are well aware of illegal trafficking of weapons from territories under Ukrainian control and cannot but pose a threat of these weapons to fall into hands of terrorist groups and gangs. And I hope that Sofia itself knows the situation.
We regret that this factor has also been ignored. And a few words on the attempts of a number of unfriendly steps to create a quasi-legal mechanism to use frozen Russian assets to receive reparations from our country. A number of states have long tried to come up with such kind of a tool so they could get their hands on the frozen assets, but basically these are assets that they stole. And the West tries to promote this initiative at the United Nations platform. They developed a draft resolution and they intend to adopt it on the 14th of November in order to bring Russia to justice for alleged violation of international law in Ukraine, including human rights norms. I would like to disappoint the sponsors, the authors of this initiative, and to take them down a notch. For starters, their only goal is to get a political blessing from the General Assembly to bypass the norms of international and national law, namely the ones that are aimed at protecting the property of foreign assets. And this will be a flagrant violation of the state immunity and the principle of sovereign equality of states. Basically, we are talking about a common robbery, as we have repeatedly highlighted, and the illegitimately taken Russian financial assets would serve one specific goal: to fund the American military and industrial sector, and that is not hidden by anyone, but maybe it is more comfortable for them to shun away, or as one of the European representatives told me, you don't understand the scale of politicization over this issue. Don't you think that we vote against Russia? We are voting in order to protect ourselves. So this is the kind of position of the international community, and a European representative cannot save them and cannot protect them. It only fuels further politicization. Let me remind you that the General Assembly resolutions are purely advisory and they are not legally binding. The General Assembly does not impose any legal obligations on the UN member states. The General Assembly is not entitled to bring states to justice. And we also repeatedly warn the international community, and we reiterate once again, if such a precedent with the robbery of Russian assets is established, then tomorrow any other state could find itself in our shoes. A state that is not to the liking of Washington. Examples abound. Anglo-Saxons got used to freezing assets, but they do not know how to unfreeze them. And another topic, related topic, recently there's been a statement by the official representative of Germany's government, Christian Hoffmann, and her statement was quite telling. I draw your attention to the statement because it is just one of many of such claims that we hear. She made her statement on the 7th of November, and we would like to refute and denounce these remarks. During her government conference, she dwelled on the fact that the Russian side is not ready to negotiate with the Kiev regime. And in her view, the Kiev regime is showing this readiness. I believe it's high time to get back to reality. We have repeatedly clarified to those who do not have access to the internet, allegedly, we have clarified our position and will continue to do that. Russia is ready to negotiate, and it has not changed. Let me reiterate that. We see that our words do not reach out to many in Germany. Maybe they cannot perceive it. Maybe that's the issue with the German media, who are taking a selective approach when dealing with information. Instead of using its clout and its influence on the Ukrainian authorities, the German side, despite their own laws and rules that ban export of lethal weapons in crisis regions, they continue to pump Kiev with weapons systems, thus encouraging hostilities at all costs. Such steps show that Berlin is acting in accordance with the guidelines of the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell. He believes that the conflict should be resolved on the battlefield, as well as the consensus to protract the conflict by all means. It is the Anglo-Saxon big brothers who are actually urging to protect the conflict. Ukraine withdrew at the behest of Western partners from the negotiating process that took place this spring and was quite gradual. And the Kiev banned a dialogue with Russia at the legislative level after that. The Ukrainian leadership and officials voiced some preconditions that are out of touch. And this confirms that the Kiev regime and its mentors in the West do not have any sense of reality. So they need to combine everything to make up their minds to read something and to stop this misleading information. Let me reiterate once again. We hope that our partners, quote unquote, could realize that we are ready for negotiations. We have never abandoned them, and we are ready to conduct these negotiations, taking into account the realities that we are witnessing as of now. Moving on to another topic on our agenda, a few words on the United States. Despite the fact that the first committee of the General Assembly adopted the resolution on the anti-satellite weapons, our position has not changed. We believe that the moratorium that was adopted by the White House on the test of these anti-satellite weapons is a purely declarative step. We have reiterated previously that the statements and draft resolutions alone are clearly not enough to prevent arms race in the outer space, especially for a country that since 2008 has been having the habit of destroying space objects by anti-satellite weapons. The thing is that the US cunningly keeps silence on one thing, whether they are ready to rule out the combat use of such types of weapons. By the way, the resolution does not mention it whatsoever. There are no commitments with regard to the development and production of such systems and the possibilities of destroying of existing anti-satellite capabilities. Moreover, it cannot be ruled out that anti-satellite weapons could be deployed on an X-37B reusable robotic spacecraft. It is capable of being on the orbit for a long period of time and to maneuver and carry payload. We repeatedly asked the US to clarify their tasks and goals with regard to the X-37B, and we didn't receive any reply. To get a better understanding of the clear aspiration of Washington, it is reasonable to take a look at the doctrinal documents and their aspiration to have a military dominance in the outer space, as well as their perception of the outer space as an area of confrontation. And that is the reason why the American delegation at the Geneva Disarmament Conference impedes negotiations by all means. negotiations on multilateral tool that would have credible international legal guarantees against the placement of weapons in outer space, refusal to use force or threat of force with regard to any space objects. The Americans shun from the work on Russia-Chinese draft that seeks to address the relevant tasks, namely to prevent arms race in the outer space. Basically, Washington is just trying to replace diplomatic efforts with some unconvincing actions in the public eye and to sell to the international community another half measure. Especially cynical is the moratorium on the ban of these systems and some future initiatives as a contribution by the US to develop a multilateral legally binding tool to prevent arms race in outer space. But everybody knows the real worth of Washington's pledges. We urge the US to show indeed that their initiative is really worth something. Namely, they should refuse to have any tests, as well as other critically important types of military activities, be it the development of anti-satellite weapons or their placement and use. That would be telling if Washington could revisit the previous destructive position and the engagement of its delegation at the disarmament conference, its engagement to the efforts to launch negotiations on legally binding instruments with regard to non-placement of weapons in outer space. And for our part, we are ready to support multilateral efforts to comprehensively address the tasks of preventing arms race in the outer space. On the 16th of November, Moscow will host a fourth meeting of the Afghanistan format, bringing together key regional stakeholders that seek to have a peaceful Afghan settlement. The meeting will discuss military and political, social, economic and humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, with a special focus on coordinating efforts to strengthen regional security and stability and facilitating inter-Afghan national reconciliation. The meeting will result in a joint statement of parties. Lebanon, the country is in a dire systemic crisis triggered by external influence. The 79th anniversary of its independence on the 22nd of November will be celebrated without a president whose tenure expired on the 31st of October. He left his presidential palace, and the prime minister is acting head of state, and the parliament is divided into several political groups. There will be another attempt to elect a president, and it will take place tomorrow on the 10th of November. It's hard to predict how successful it will be. As for the finances and the economy of the once prosperous Lebanese Republic, they are in a dire state. After the banking system collapse in late 2019, the savings turned out to be frozen, and the national currency exchange rate dropped by 27 times. As of now, even the Lebanese capital has no central power supply. There are frequent gas supply disruptions, shortage of heating oil. That is used to heat civilian infrastructure and homes. Since the West artificially created a food crisis, there's a real risk of shortage in coarse grain and food grain. Living standards of the most vulnerable groups of the population are plummeting, and which is evidenced by the cholera outbreak. Lebanon is in dire need of political support as well as large-scale financial assistance, but those external masterminds pursued their self-serving geopolitical goals, and basically they drove the country to its current state. And they're not hasty in doing something to overcome these repercussions. Moreover, Washington holds regional projects to supply natural gas from Egypt to Lebanon and power supply from Jordan, with the use of existing transport infrastructure. Washington doesn't have time for that. It is involved in a project Destroy Ukraine, and that's where it invests billions of dollars. The Lebanese politicians face unparalleled pressure in order to change the well-balanced foreign political course by Beirut, to isolate and marginalize the unwanted forces at the domestic arena. I'm talking about Hezbollah. Lebanon is a country with well-developed political traditions, and the attempts of the boorish Western dictate going as far as the US military interventions in 1950s and 1980s. These attempts have failed miserably each and every time. And here we see the methods of economic blackmail that are used by the West. Millions of Syrian refugees have become a severe burden for Lebanon, and a huge thanks goes to Western countries, including the United States, who were involved in these experiments in the region. It is telling that the collective West doesn't lift a finger to assist their return to their homeland. It did not support the process of collective repatriation of Syrians. On the contrary, they're doing everything possible to preserve this painful issue. But actually, that was the hallmark of the US policy. Russia has been supporting the sovereignty, independence, and unity, as well as territorial integrity of Lebanon. We believe that the urgent problems of national agenda shall be addressed without external interference, based on all Lebanese consensus that would guarantee the balance of legitimate interests of the leading political associations and religious groups. We believe that the political maturity of the Lebanese society, their stamina, and the ability to reach an agreement would help ensure such decisions that would enable the normal functioning of all the branches of power. We see the suffering of the friendly Lebanese people, and we will provide all the necessary assistance to the extent possible. And another very relevant topic, and probably I cannot answer all the questions when I voice these materials, but nevertheless, let us satisfy the information famine, so to speak, of those who are keeping their eyes on the Armenian and Azeri conflict. Today marks 2 years since the adoption by the President of Russia, the President of Azerbaijan, and the Prime Minister of Armenia of the statement on the ceasefire. And this step put an end to the bloodshed. It launched the normal, peaceful life in the region. The Russian peacekeeping troops, in line with this statement, are efficiently implementing the tasks at hand. They are making a significant contribution to stabilizing the situation and ensuring security in the region. This is appreciated by our Azeri and Armenian friends. The trilateral arrangements of leaders enshrined in their statements on the 9th of November 2020, 11th of January and 26th of November 2021, and the 31st of October 2022 laid the foundation for the comprehensive normalization of relations between the two states. The Sectoral Trilateral Working Group, co-chaired by Vice Prime Ministers, has done a great deal to unblock transport communications, and we are moving towards implementing specific projects in Southern Caucasus. In line with the leaders' decision on the 26th of November, we established the bilateral commission on delimitation of the Armenian-Azerbaijani border with the future demarcation with the consultative advisory assistance of Russia. And there is also a mechanism which is of crucial importance to stabilize the situation in the border. We are closely coordinating with our partners when it comes to the peace treaty. Russia actively participates to build trust between the peoples of Azerbaijan and Armenia, to develop dialogue between representatives of these countries. Russia will continue to provide all the necessary assistance to Baku and Yerevan in order to ensure peace, stability, and prosperity in Southern Caucasus. I understand that you would smile today probably, because it's hard to talk about these topics without smiling, but at the same time, it's a tragedy and a comedy all at once, because the situation is funny to the limit, but at the same time, it is pretty serious.
The head of the Association of National Olympic Committee, General Assembly, Thomas Bach, stated that the 36 Summer Olympics of 2024 to be held in Paris, and I quote him, will be the first Olympic Games with full gender parity. End of sight. In doing so, he also recalled the importance of the IOC principle that every athlete should have access to sport without discrimination. So, one more time, I would like to say that it is difficult to figure out what they are talking about this discrimination. So, if we count all the genders that have been registered at the global level, so the number is of 80. So do all of the 80 genders will participate in the Olympic Games? Or maybe the Olympic Games will be changed and will be divided into groups and smaller groups, or people will be enlisted in these groups because of their sexual appearances. So, if we are talking about the IOC principle that every athlete should have access to sport without discrimination, so I believe that we should agree with this principle, especially in conditions when the unfair decision of the IOC and a number of international sport federations, Russian athletes were excluded from legitimate participation in many significant sport competitions and championships, as well as the Russian Federation was deprived of the opportunity to host a large number of competitions. So, does it have something in line with the IOC principle? Unfortunately, the IOC leadership has forgotten the principles laid down by the organizer of the modern Olympic movement, one of the main mottos of which was sport beyond politics. So I believe that this proclaimed gender parity is another thing that underpins the principles of Olympic Games. So it is expected that I would like to quote, that there will be justice, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and gender differences. And end of quote. So let's call a spade a spade. We are witnessing a neoliberal transformation of world sport, abandon of traditional values, and the imposition on the global community of a new normal. But in fact, it is not normal. It is not natural in sport. Right now, can I answer a question? Have they asked everyone if the Western community cares about these traditional values? So I would like to ask about the number of countries and about their opinion. What does the population in this country think about these processes? But they didn't ask anyone. They impose it through elites, and such innovations threaten the existence of women's sport. And a lot of athletes are talking about it, because right now sex-swapped men who have a clear physical advantage will be allowed to participate in the competition. So what kind of fair play and access to sport without discrimination with Thomas Bach is so concerned about can we talk about right now? So you know, I'm not a specialist in this field. I'm a person who follows this issue. I'm an observer and I have a question. The theme of doping is over right now, isn't it? So when the Russian athletes were excluded from championships and events because they win these competitions, and the European Western athletes do not want Russians to win, and that is why the theme of Russian doping has already been neglected. And in this regard, I have a question. One more time. A question from an observer. We understand that when the change of this gender identity is going on, and then this change can be fixed, we can witness it according to physical appearance of this person. This person takes a lot of pills on the basis of hormones and other medicine. I would like to remind you that Maria Zakharova, outstanding tennis player, was downgraded because she took vitamins that were free. It was very easy to get this medicine from drugstores, and then they decided that this medicine was prohibited. And we do not who took this decision, but they decided it so. And right now, these people who changed its sex, right now they are taking a lot of pills, a lot of medicine. And what about the tests? What about the probes of doping? Are they going to bring a paper, a medical paper, that they need this therapy? But can we allow them to use these pills and at the same time take part in the competition? Is it okay? For our part, we would like to emphasize that sport shouldn't become a field of notorious experiments, and it is a part of experiments, of global experiments on the mankind at all, and the principle of non-discrimination and equal treatment cannot be used to violate the rights of female athletes and to create advantages of some vulnerable groups. We proceed from the fact that the division into men's and women's competition remains the only fair standard for competitive sports, and we believe that the idea of preservation of purely non-politicized sports movement is shared by most countries of the world and will find expression in the new forms of organization of international sports competition. I would like to say one more time that the International Olympic Committee should consider the global opinion unless the IOC abandons democracy at all. And one more time about democracy. We are witnessing the attempts of the US to gain momentum in Central Asia in order to encourage the states to follow their illimitable sanctions against Russia. They are doing so in a brutal manner with absurd standards, and of course we are following the increasing number of trips of US experts that are promising assistance and launching of promising projects for Central Asian countries, and all these projects are of anti-Russian sentiment. Donald Lu, Deputy Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, recently visited Central Asia capitals and promised liberation from secondary sanctions, assistance with energy supplies, and even jobs for migrants who left Russia. And the main topic as a refrain was a thesis that America is capable of becoming a profitable alternative to Moscow and Beijing. So the most important thing is that those who are going to host these guests, they should remember the story about Pinocchio, how Pinocchio was robbed. And our partners and allies in Central Asia, as well as our neighbors in Afghanistan, remember how the Afghan epic ended, and how Americans wreaked havoc there. These experiments to impose democratization, on which Washington spares no money, preparing the ground for color revolutions, demonstrating good intentions. So Washington is intended to turn independent countries into obedient satellites, in order to submit them to neo-colonial dictatorship, allowing them to pump resources and impose the notorious Western values. But Russia respects the countries of Central Asia. We are acting transparently for the development and economic prosperity of our countries. The relations within the framework of the CIS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the CSTO, the Central Asia plus Russia format are steadily expanding, despite the attempts to undermine or destroy the situation carried out by friendly countries led by the United States. And right now, let's talk about cinema. There is a famous film that will be interesting for those who are interested in soft and hard power of Britain. I'm talking about a film that was broadcasted on the NTV channel, England and Russia, Deceit Without Love. So it is about Russian-Britain relations from the times of Ivan the Terrible till now. It includes materials from the Central Archives of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, as well as from the Central Security Service, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the National Archive from Great Britain. So it also includes rare materials and news reels with the comments made by outstanding diplomats, historians, both Russian and Britain's. If you have missed this film, you can watch it on the NTV channel, and the link is on the Russian Foreign Minister website. So the first episode is about provocation that London has been staging for many years. For example, the first episode shows the attempts either to explore or to mine the ship that Khrushchev used to visit London. And it is of clear political aim, and it leaves no doubt about the British trace in the last terrorist attack in the Black Sea. Moreover, it relieves the subversive activities of Great Britain against our country. For example, the deal of Lockhart. It was a British attempt to instigate counter-revolutionary coup in Soviet Russia in 1918. So the project was called Undermining Russia, and I'm going to provide further information as well as a link for this project. And today at 12:30 a.m. Moscow time, the second episode will be broadcasted, and we're going to provide the link on the Ministry for Foreign Affairs website and as well as in Telegram channel. The film Hitler's British Roots is about how his rise to power in Nazi Germany was received in Britain. And here I would like to spoil this information because it was received with understanding and with approving. So I recommend you to watch this film. You will see how young Queen was praising Hitler. It is no fake, it is a fact. The film also shows the tremendous efforts that Britons took against the Soviet Union. The links of the chain will include the Hitler's policy of appeasement, as well as the Munich Agreement and the mistake. Program including thematic blocks on Second World War and the Great Patriotic War, and the number of Russian and foreign films has already exceeded 150. For example, we should pay special attention to the program called Actual Donbass, about hostilities and people living in the armed conflict. It is symbolical that the core of this festival, that is the preservation of historical truth about the Great Patriotic War, is held in Volgograd, a hero city forever enshrined in the history because of the feat and sacrifices of Soviet soldiers in the Battle of Stalingrad. The festival will be open on the 19th of November, and that is the date when the Operation Uran started. And another event that I cannot but mention. On November the 3rd, the 6th, St. Petersburg hosted the first international circus art festival without borders. They were representatives of more than 150 artists from 19 countries such as Azerbaijan, Hungary, Vietnam, Spain, Italy, Cuba, Moldova, France, Peru, Ethiopia. There was an international jury that included the representatives of international circle elite from Bulgaria, Hungary, Spain, Italy, the US, Turkey, France, and other countries. This festival organized by our country, brought together the representatives of different circus schools of different regions all over the world, and it proved that there is no limitations for true talents people. They are ready to get together to participate in this cultural event in order to preserve the most important thing in such turbulent times.
I'm talking about normal people-to-people contacts. The ability to understand each other, to hear and to listen to each other is very important. Of course, we see obstacles that are actively imposed by a number of states to our contacts, but in my view, that is just doomed to failure. Russia will further develop the creative dialogue, the dialogue of cultures and civilizations, who will facilitate exchange of best practices and strengthening of international humanitarian cooperation. With that, I'm ready to take your questions. Do we have International Life with us? Good day, Madam Zakharova. Hello. Since Lula da Silva was elected Brazilian president, will there be a new momentum in Russia-Brazil bilateral cooperation and a dialogue within BRICS? First of all, I would like to draw your attention to the comment published at the Foreign Ministry's website on the 31st of October. It is quite detailed. It is dedicated to the outcomes of the general election in Brazil, and it has analysis and overview of this event. I just want to say that we count on further gradual development of Russia-Brazil strategic partnership and constructive interaction of our countries in international entities. We assume that specific tracks and formats of bilateral cooperation will be shaped as the new administration is formed and as it builds its foreign political policy. As for the dialogue within BRICS, let me remind you that Luis Inácio Lula da Silva was one of the founding fathers of this unique multilateral mechanism. As for our experience of interacting with Brazil within the BRICS format, it shows that the Brazilian administrations have been always advocating cooperation on all major tracks: policy and security, economy and finance, culture and humanitarian contacts, and we assume that this position is not prone to foreign political or external political situation, because the Brazil's participation in BRICS meets its national interest and the role of one of the leading actors in the international arena as an emerging developing economy. We expect that such an approach will be preserved after Luis Inácio Lula da Silva comes into office. Thank you. If I may, I have another question. Lately, there have been fake news, including at the level of US officials, on alleged supplies of North Korean artillery munitions to Russia so that they could be used during the special military operation in Ukraine. How would you comment on this topic? Indeed, we saw such statements by John Kirby. We also heard Ned Price saying that Washington has additional plans to impose some extra sanctions against Pyongyang. There are no clear clarification of these statements and no substance behind that. But there could be no justification, because everything that they say is just blatant lie. Maybe they just needed another round of sanctions, and they just cooked up, invented this excuse to do that. Thank you. Let's move on. Do we have Rossiya Сегодня, Russia Today, with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. I have the following question. Lately, the Japanese media outlets quoted their sources and stated that Tokyo intends to buy cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, from Washington. What's your take on that? Well, if these reports are true, that shows once again that Kishida's administration has a reckless desire to have this accelerated militarization. There were some references to the North Korean threat, but they just conceal the main goal: to demolish swiftly the pacifist past of the country, to launch modernization of the armed forces, to serve aggressive military strategic tasks in the region. We have repeatedly emphasized that the gaining of its offensive capabilities by Japan and expanding military and political cooperation with the US will further trigger destabilization in the Asia-Pacific, and it will require a more clear account of this situation in the context of ensuring protection of our country and its borders. If you have no other questions, let's move on. Vedomosti. Vedomosti, are you here with us? All right then. Yes, I'm here. Hello. Good day, Madam Zakharova. A question on Serbia once again. To what extent is Russia ready to provide assistance to Serbia in case of real hostilities there? Are we prepared to supply troops and weaponry there? Well, I got your question. Over the past days, due to the provocative behavior by the so-called Kosovo authorities, Belgrade had to put their troops on high alert in the areas adjacent to Kosovo. The Serbian leadership has repeatedly claimed that it is resolved to take all the necessary measures to protect compatriots that live there. The West is directly responsible for the ongoing situation and for the behavior of its protégés in Pristina, and so far it has done nothing to ensure progress in the Kosovo settlement. And by the way, this Kosovo settlement should take place in the form of a dialogue. Let me emphasize once again, that is not happening, and hence Kosovo is encouraged to resort to more harsh military actions. At the same time, the Serbian side is blamed in advance. We strongly support Belgrade's commitment to address the Kosovo issue by peaceful means based on the UNSC Resolution 1244. We know, judging by our own experience, that the military scenario in the Balkans could lead to disastrous repercussions. That is why it is the task of diplomacy to seek mutually acceptable solution. Let me reiterate once again, a special responsibility for the outcome of negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina lies on the European Union. In 2010, it was called a mediator by the General Assembly. It is dangerous to ponder on other options for settlement. It would only impose some unfair, humiliating models that would give rise to another spiral of conflict. Let me just add a couple of words. These pondering and deliberations on what happens if something happens, it's not within our purview, and we assume that we need to comment on the facts. As for the analysis and forecasting, it should be within the purview of experts. Do we have Associated Press with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. We have the following question. Foreign Minister of Ukraine headed for Cambodia for ASEAN summit. How do you feel about the fact that Ukraine would participate in the ASEAN summit for the first time, and that it concluded a treaty on friendship and good neighborliness. Well, we have nothing to do with this process. We have nothing to do with this question or with this topic altogether. As for our participation in the events in Cambodia, I have dwelled on that. We are talking about the participation of the Russian delegation headed by Sergei Lavrov, and he will participate in the East Asia Summit on the 13th of November. It will bring together ASEAN states as well as its dialogue partners. Since you have no further questions, let's move on. Do we have Reuters? Good evening, Madam Zakharova. Reuters sources in the U.S. State Department claim that over the past months, Russia and the U.S. have reached a certain arrangement on extra staffing of their embassies. As a result, the American embassy saw additional employees working in Russia. Could you confirm or denounce these arrangements? Do you have any details? So what kind of sources are you talking about? Reuters sources? Yes. Well, the thing is that they received this information at a certain point in time, at a certain day, and that is just the routine of our work. We have some targeted contacts, isolated contacts, and they're dedicated to this matter. Washington has unleashed this diplomatic fuss. It extended diplomats. That is why we're dealing manually, so to speak, with addressing this issue on a parity basis. I'm talking about issues that have to do with staffing of our missions abroad. In the past, previously, I'm talking about the situation 10 years ago. So back in the day, there were just general arrangements on the number of diplomatic employees, technical employees, and the like. There were no detailed solutions of the kind of matters. How many employees will come to our country in this specific month or year? It was not happening in the past, but now it is a routine, and it is something, not a pleasant situation that we have to face due to the Washington's policy. So please tell to your sources or a journalist who has a contact with these sources that this is a daily work. This is a work in progress. What diplomats would replace other diplomats, and what diplomats would be sent to another country on a parity basis. So each and every beginning of diplomat's mission, long-term mission, is subject to this procedure. Given that a diplomat from another country, from the United States, should come to work to Russia, well, if you ask me whether it was our desire, it was our wish to have this situation, not in the slightest. It is outrageous for us to see this kind of situation in the 21st century, when there could be a simplification of visa procedures to the maximum extent possible. But unfortunately, the United States sees our relationship in this way. We are drowned in this swamp. So don't you think that this is some kind of a breaking news? It's just a routine on a daily basis that we deal with that has to do with sending of Russian and American diplomats to Washington and to Moscow. So we have a certain term among diplomats, an exchange, when we agree on the timeline, on the dates of the mission, and the diplomatic position. So this is a manual procedure. Okay, I got it. Well, it's good that you got it, because it's impossible to understand that. It's just nonsense. This is absurd. I can't recall anything of this kind happening in some point in time in the past. Indeed, there were some stop lists in the past when a country didn't want to see a specific person in its territory, maybe an official, for certain reasons, but these were just isolated individual cases. It was not systemic, but we are witnessing this situation currently, and that is caused by the American position. Do you have any other questions? Yes, I have two other questions. I would like to go back to the publication by the Wall Street Journal earlier this week. It stated that the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, had his meetings with the Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, and the Foreign Policy Advisor, Yuri Ushakov. And the goal of negotiations, according to the Wall Street Journal, is to protect from the escalation risk. The State Department gave no comment, and I would like to ask you, can you confirm these contacts? Well, first, we have these isolated contacts with the United States. And secondly, every agency and ministry comments on contacts, telephone calls, meetings at its own level, if it deems it necessary. Third, at the level of heads of foreign ministries, there were no contacts of that sort, so I have nothing to comment. As for the other agencies, you can ask them, or maybe they provided the relevant information in this regard. And certainly we factor out contacts at the level of embassies. This is the work in progress. And last question that has to do with the START treaty. According to sources close to the State Department, there are no full-fledged negotiations on the START treaty. At the same time, there are contacts on mutual inspections. So such contacts do take place, and can you comment on that matter? We saw different messages in this regard. We saw media reports stating that Russia withdrew from the New START treaty. Let us wipe it out altogether. It was not about Russia's withdrawal from the New START treaty. That's the first thing. Secondly, we have not ceased the professional dialogue with the American side. We exchanged documents, and we have a dialogue on other existing channels. Namely, soon there will be another session of the Bilateral Consultative Commission on the New START treaty. So it would not be right to talk about some kind of a negotiating process. It's not a negotiating process. It's just a practical work, constant work on the whole range of issues that have to do with the implementation of the treaty. Russia-US interaction is taking place by the exchange of the relevant notifications on the changes in the capabilities of both of the sides. Russia has specific claims with regard to the US and how it treats its obligations under this treaty. We intend to raise an issue, the long-standing issue about the withdrawal from accountability of dozens of bombers and submarines. According to the American side, they are re-equipped and they are not capable of carrying nuclear weapons. The Russian experts should have an opportunity to ascertain it. There is no clarity in this matter, and that is unacceptable. Our country continues to strictly abide by the New START treaty. Currently, Russia temporarily withdrew its START capabilities from the inspection activities under the treaty until the technical impediments are alleviated due to the US anti-Russian restrictions, and they impede inspections on an equal footing. There are some problematic matters that we have repeatedly clarified. At the same time, some aspects should be clarified. I'm talking about inspections that have to do with the pandemic, with the COVID-19, and in this area, not everything has gone back on track. That's it. Thank you.
Do we have Moldova, the TV channel Publica TV? Yes, we are present. Good day. Ms. Zakharova. In November, Gazprom unilaterally said that it is going to reduce the gas supplies by 15%. Official Chisinau representatives believes that it is a political pressure that Russia uses to change Moldova's European course. First of all, how do you explain the reduction in gas supplies? And does it have something in common with political issues such as the Moldova's European policy that we pursue? And the last phrase, could you repeat it, please? Does it have something to do with the European course of the Republic of Moldova that the Moldovan authorities proclaim and pursue? And we have repeatedly stated that all the issues of the gas supplies to Moldova are purely commercial and fall under responsibility of the Gazprom company. So we believe that you should address this issue to the colleagues, and they do not spare efforts to answer quickly your questions. But the Prime Minister said that it was a politically motivated decision. Right now, I'm not talking about your authorities. I'm talking about you, about journalists. For example, it is my recommendation for you to send your question to Gazprom. And right now, as for the attempts of Russia to allegedly use gas supplies as some kind of energy weapon, but I believe that it looks like a nonsense. Everything was, everything has been okay. It was peace for more than 10 years when Russia has been supplying gas and other energy resources. Right now, I'm talking about the situation that has existed for decades. I'm not talking about the events 50 years ago. Right now, I'm saying that we have been supplying gas to Moldova, to Europe, for the last decades, and we have repeatedly heard that it is our Russian energy weapon, but everyone has been using this energy weapon, calling it weapon. So it is very interesting. It is a very interesting position. So when this so-called poison, when you lack this kind of poison, you demand more and more supplies of this poison. I'm not maintaining a dialogue with you. I'm trying to answer your question. If you have other questions, you can send them to me and I will respond them via written form. It is a very interesting logic that you have. It is either an energy weapon or a fuel resource. But we should acknowledge that for many years, and still, we are a reliant gas supplier of energy resources. So you should talk about it in this vein. Either you should call it an energy weapon. Let's proceed to another thing. Unfortunately, this rhetoric is now being used by the Moldovan leadership at the instigation of the Western masters, so-called partners. But it is of anti-Russian sentiment. Apparently, the benefits that Moldovan authorities see from this Western policy, so these policies fraught with consequences. We believe that the social, economic, and internal political situation in the country is so difficult that these stories about so-called Russian military threat is no longer enough to divert attention from citizens from the pressing problems. And let's move to gas supplies. In October 2021, the contract for the supply of Russian gas to Moldova was extended on the most favorable terms for Moldova. And it was even confirmed by the Moldovan authorities. After that, the Moldova Gas Company repeatedly violated agreements on payment terms for the gas supplies and asked Gazprom to relax contractual obligations regarding the volume of supplies. The Russian side has always been sympathetic, and we believe that the accusations are far-fetched and they are used to change Moldova's European course. And when we delivered gas to Europe, did we want to change the European policy as well? So we believe that we have never considered it as an obstacle for the development of Russian-Moldovan cooperation. At the same time, the current Moldovan leadership, which declares a commitment to the European integration, declares the need to find alternative sources of energy resources to replace the Russian gas. But I would like to remind that Brussels in March announced this decision to refuse Russian energy carriers in advance until 2030. I beg your pardon. Whose pressure we're talking about? If you're talking about the Moldovan European crisis, you should understand that if the Moldovan authorities proclaimed its European course in foreign policy, if your own authorities declares the commitment to Brussels policy, then the Moldovan authority also proclaims its commitments to Joseph Borrell and Brussels' statement over the termination of the use of Russian energy supplies until 2030. And why are you talking about Russian gas right now? So we have a strong basis of cooperation with our partners that is time-tested. We did never announce that in advance until 2030 everyone should abandon the use of Russian resources. No, on the contrary, we are ready to make deals with our partners to fulfill the contractual obligations, and we hope that in the future Moldova will refrain from politicization of its interaction with Gazprom and fulfill its obligations under the gas contracts on time. I would like to remind you that it is a contract. So you have another question, I believe. Ms. Zakharova, right now, the Russian side is waiting for Moldova to fulfill its obligation, but Gazprom reduced its gas supplies by 50%. Does it mean that Gazprom itself fulfills its obligations? I beg your pardon. I have already commented on it. If we're talking about contract obligations, so it is for the Gazprom company to deal with this issue. So I believe that if you're talking about some violations of the contractual obligations, so it is up to Gazprom to figure it out. But you shouldn't accuse Russia that has been supplying energy resources, Russian gas, for decades. You shouldn't blame Russia for carrying out a terrorist attack on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 because it is nonsense. I beg your pardon. It is nonsense. It is absurd. I'm sure. I believe that it is fuel sources, and we need these energy sources and repay for them. Sorry, but did the Moldovan party fulfill all the obligations for its part? So I don't think so. I believe that the Moldovan side has repeatedly violated the obligations for the gas supplies and asked Gazprom to relax contractual obligations regarding the volume of supplies. Do you know it? Yes, I do. If you do know about it, so why are you talking about these obligations right now? Moldova Gas has already fulfilled all the obligations, all the contractual obligations, and right now we do not understand why Gazprom is still reducing gas supplies. We do not understand. So I beg your pardon, but you should address your questions. You should send your questions to the Gazprom company, and then we will figure out this situation and we will provide further information on this issue and include all the materials, all the relevant information in my next briefing. But I ask you, I urge you not to blame Russia anymore, not to say that Russia is using gas as an energy weapon, because we supply energy resources for heating, for well-being of European and Moldovan citizens. So it looks like nonsense, and the fact that you follow these logics, that is why you have these problems. So you shouldn't leave. So I beg your pardon, but in the Commission asked. The Commission reviewed the issue of Russian missiles fell on the territory of Chisinau, but the Russian Defense Ministry did not comment on this issue. Why it is so? So I beg your pardon, but last briefing, we talked about it. If you are interested in extra information, you should send your question and I will respond it. Do we have Verelk with us? Yes, we're present. Good day. Today I have 3 questions for you. The first one, how would you comment on the outcomes of the talks in Washington between the foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia? Can you say that the sides have chosen a settlement under the auspices of the western side of Russia, given the planned meeting of the 2 leaders in Brussels in November? Judging by the statements made by the both countries at the meeting of the foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia, mentioned by you, the exchange of views on the preparation of a peace treaty continued. So I believe that they will follow these commitments. I would like to remind you that in the joint statement of 21st of October this year, the heads of state stressed the importance of preparing a peace treaty between Baku and Yerevan in order to achieve sustainable and long-lasting peace in the region. For our part, we will provide all possible assistance to this process. And regarding Russia's role in the settlement, even at the Sochi summit, the leaders reaffirmed their commitment to these trilateral agreements. So it is these agreements that form the basis for joint work on the comprehensive normalization of Armenia-Azerbaijani relations. So my second question, what is the attitude in Moscow to the information campaign against Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijani media after the trilateral meeting in Sochi? So you know that any propaganda or destructive campaign, both political and media campaign, so we read it and we have an assessment of that, but in terms of Russian peacekeepers, so this issue was raised, and the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia noted the key contribution of the Russian troops to ensuring security and stabilization of the situation in the region. This was recorded in the joint statement. And right now, in terms of some dirty facts about this situation, any positive, constructive thesis will forever provoke some negative comments. So this is the world we are living in. And my last question. The first deputy chairman of the State Duma Committee on the CIS Affairs, Mr. Konstantin Zatulin, said that the Russian foreign minister is going to send a request to the Armenian foreign ministry to clarify the situation with the entry ban into American for him. Has any answer been received from the Armenian foreign ministry? So regretfully, we have never received any answer, but when we get it, we will provide further information. But right now, at this moment, we do not have any information on it. Do we have the portal newsroom with us? Yes, we are present. Good afternoon, Ms. Zakharova. The theme of my second question, you have already mentioned this topic, but I would like to clarify the situation with the grain deal. The Turkish authorities intended to extend the grain agreement for another year. Does the Russian side plan to extend the agreement? So I cannot say that we are talking about negotiations. So you are asking about Russian attitude to the extension of the Great Deal. Right now we are considering this fact. But as you know, Russia resumed its participation in the agreements on the export of grain from Ukrainian ports. But this deal includes two parts. This is a package deal, and all these talks, we have these talks not for the first time, and we stated that this deal is of 120 days with the possibility to extend this deal. But let's proceed to the most important thing. The Black Sea Initiative with the Russia-UN Memorandum on agricultural products and fertilizers. They are two integral parts of a key package deal proposed by the UN Secretary General. So it was implemented in order to improve the situation on global markets. So we believe that companies, it is not for companies to provide fertilizers and goods. So since the economic point of view, we were talking about the global problems such as the food crisis, and we are ready to do our utmost to overcome this problem, to ensure food stability and security. But this part of the deal has never been implemented. We proceeded from this fact. We proceeded from the fact that we're talking about global food stability and security. As for our part, we have done everything possible. We expressed our readiness to implement the grain deal in order to help the whole world to overcome the food crisis. And right now it means that both documents should be implemented, and the implemented should complement each other. With that in mind, we are obliged to draw attention to the second part of the deal.
It's the second part, but it's equally important. Washington and Brussels made various statements that Russian fertilizers and food is exempt from sanctions, but at the same time, our producers and suppliers face difficulties during their payments, insurance, freight, and it went as far as the free of charge provision of fertilizers and grain to the countries in need is something that was blocked by the Western capitals. So we're talking about the profit by American, by British suppliers and producers filling their pockets. And this was the case during the pandemic. They claimed that their priority is to protect the global citizens, but at the same time they blocked the certification of vaccines that were not produced in Anglo-Saxon countries, while Russia faced this kind of attitude. In this regard, we plan to hold another round of consultations between Russian interagency delegation led by Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin and the UNCTAD Secretary General Rebecca Greenspan and head of the United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths. They are in charge of the Russia-UN Memorandum and the Black Sea Initiative. Thank you. And the second question, Vatican would be ready to mediate in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and it suggests that its territory could be used as a neutral platform for negotiations. According to La Stampa newspaper, in your view, could the Pope be the main mediator in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? The thing is that the Holy See has sent messages time and again that it is ready to provide assistance to achieve peace in Ukraine. We welcome such a commitment. Russia pays deep respect to the peacekeeping efforts of Pope Francis. It consistently promotes humanistic values. As you might know, we have an ongoing meaningful dialogue with Vatican on a number of issues, including humanitarian ones, and we thank the Pontiff for this mediation proposal. It is indeed very valuable. However, there is another part of the deal and another part of the conflict, and in this case, all the founding decisions that have to do with the fate of Ukraine are taken not in Kiev, and it is the West that undermined the negotiations that just started. Let's move on. Do we have Vesnik Kavkaza? Hello. Antony Blinken had a meeting with Ararat Mirzayan and Mr. Bayramov, and he claimed that the US is a friend of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it will help by all means to achieve solid peace in Nagorno-Karabakh. What's your take on such statements? I believe that I have already dwelled on this topic for quite some time. To be honest, I don't think it is necessary to comment on the statement by the US side that they made with regard to two sovereign states. For our part, we are doing our utmost. By the way, for many years we have been co-chairing the Minsk group, the OSCE Minsk group, have been doing it in the past, and we're doing it as a party to many statements that were signed and arrangements between the leaders of the three countries. We're doing everything possible in legal terms, in international terms, in order to put an end to this lengthy conflict. So I'm ready to comment on our actions. As for the statement of the US Secretary of State, it has nothing to do with us, and let somebody else comment on this, be it the US or Armenia or Azerbaijan. Well, as for good intentions by Washington, it raises a lot of questions because they promise a lot, but they do not much. And there's always a hidden agenda behind their promises. Washington has quite a lengthy track record of good intentions and good deeds. They cannot show in practice what they pledge. Thank you. Do you have CGTN? Hello, we have 3 questions today. On the 7th of November, in a video address to the Climate Summit participants in Egypt, Zelensky came up with 5 conditions for peaceful negotiations with Russia. At the same time, the White House asks the Ukrainian authorities to publicly show its readiness to negotiations with Russia. What is your attitude towards the statements by the US and Ukraine? Judging by your quote, Washington pledged to do this one thing. We can go far here, and it's time for the Kiev regime to decide. Either it is independent in some cases, or they can only show something at the behest of Washington. We have already touched on this topic today, but since you asked this question, I would like to reiterate it once again. We note that when it comes to negotiations, the Ukrainian regime takes an odd position. In February, Kiev initiated the negotiations and it participated in several rounds. And after that, it eliminated its negotiators. It initialed a document in late March in Istanbul, which shaped future arrangements. After that, all of a sudden, the Kiev regime halted this process, and it did not respond to our proposals, the proposals which came as an answer to their proposals. This was made at the behest of Anglo-Saxon mentors. They are not interested in achieving peace in the world, in particular in negotiating processes to this end. Later on, the Kiev regime started stubbornly denouncing the idea of a dialogue with Moscow as some kind of a notion, and the pinnacle came when Zelensky issued a decree on the 30th of September that stipulated that it is not possible to hold negotiations with the president of Russia. According to the media, we see that under the US pressure, the Kiev regime has to use and capitalize on the topic of negotiations. But at the same time, it launches some preconditions. I think that everybody should ask a question. What does Kiev want in the context of negotiations? Do they want peace? Are they ready to resume negotiations that they halted? Or is it just some empty words? Or is it all about Washington's pressure? Is it their strategy? Let them decide, let them answer. Or are we just talking about another trick by Washington that they use to curb the dissatisfaction of their society over excessive spending to the Kiev regime? At the same time, we can't help noticing what is happening in this negotiating context. Washington and its allies, NATO allies, continue to pump Ukraine with weaponry that only protracts the conflict, and it could hardly show the real interest of the West to settle this conflict by political means. Midterms in the US Congress took place. Experts believe that if Biden loses its control over Congress, it could scale down the supplies of weapons to Ukraine. Do you agree with us with this opinion? And how can these midterms influence the policy of Washington with regard to Russia? These midterm elections confirmed that the US is divided, is split, that it has an electoral process that is archaic. The voters do not trust the results. They believe that it is rigged. There were a lot of scandals and outrageous stories around the presidential campaign in 2020, and we can state with confidence that this election is yet another manifestation of a dire civil conflict in the run-up to the presidential campaign in 2024. We have no expectations or illusions whatsoever. There is a pure anti-Russian consensus, and we cannot expect any beacons of common sense among the American establishment. Certainly, the internal infighting in the US is good because it distracts the attention of the US administration from Russia that they hate so much. But we do not overestimate this factor, and we would rebuff the confrontation that is imposed to us. Nevertheless, we have never said that we are closing a door for negotiations, for a dialogue. A dialogue and diplomacy still lives on. We are ready for the normal work when and if Washington realizes that there is no point in exerting pressure on Moscow, and there's no point in dragging us into the conflict in Ukraine. That could lead to a humiliating defeat, as was the case in Vietnam and Afghanistan. As for the apocalyptic scenarios, I believe that the Washington elites should pay heed to their society, to their people, and stop imposing to their people a philosophy and a mindset that is not shared by the people. The establishment is loud and clear in their assurances, but that is not about democracy. Democracy is about paying heed to the concerns of their people and their ability to turn these concerns into real action, and that is the point behind democracy, and that the people entitle the establishment to address their own problems. Just answer me. Do you think that the Ukrainian issue is so serious for the people of the US that they're ready to invest billions to this conflict? Not in the slightest. It is the establishment that imposes to its people some kind of phobia and artificial perceptions of their own involvement into this situation. Moving on to your question, the best way for the US, amid many myriad problems, is to deal with their country, and it requires a serious refurbishment. Do you have any other questions? Yes, a recapping question. For the first time, the US Pentagon officially recognized that there are American troops in Ukraine. Do you have the relevant evidence? I have repeatedly stated that starting with 2014, they have had their foothold in Ukraine for all these long years. They have been training officers and they participated in military build-up in the Ukrainian territory. They controlled military drills in the Ukrainian territory, in the Black Sea, and they did it day in, day out. Since the beginning of the special military operation, the US actively got involved in the planning of military actions, and the Ukrainian representatives recognized that not a single strike by HIMARS doesn't take place without the agreement from the US. And the targeting took place with the coordination of the US. Basically, it was recognized by Pentagon. As for the specific evidence of American troops in Ukraine, I believe that you should ask the Defense Ministry of Russia. Let me note that we don't have any illusions regarding the fact who is waging a war against us in Ukraine and who is using its army, who is using neo-Nazis, and who led it to this kind of a situation, and who uses it as its cannon fodder to serve their geopolitical goals. I'm talking about the United States of America, and not the people of the US, but the political establishment that for many years wanted to have a fight with our country. I'm not talking about all groups of the establishment, but a significant part of the political establishment. So we are confronting the Western attempts, not only attempts, but a genuine hybrid war by the West against us. It is a new type of hybrid war, but it's not the first time that we deal with it. You said that you had 3 questions. Let's move on. The Moscow Post. Are you here with us? Good evening. We have 2 questions since you answered some of the other questions regarding midterms in the US. I have a question regarding a meeting in Poland, meeting of members of parliament. Can the Foreign Ministry of Russia come up with a legislative initiative to deprive foreign agents of the Russian citizens that call for extremism and terrorism? You know, it is all present in the legal framework in line with our constitution. A person cannot be deprived of the Russian citizenship. At the same time, the federal law on citizenship of Russia of 2002, there are grounds for cancelling the citizenship. For instance, the decision to grant citizenship of Russia can be cancelled if it is identified that a person provided fake documents or fake data, and the relevant fact should be clarified in court. As for the court ruling, since a person has committed terrorist attacks, then it is also considered as fake data that is presented by a person applying for Russian citizenship. Thank you. With regard to the UN resolution combating glorification of Nazism, what does this term subject-based resolution mean? What is the aim of Amendment L.52? And how come that the first resolution was adopted in 2005 and not before that? So when we talk about subject-based resolution, this resolution is dedicated to a specific topic, for instance, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and so on. There could be a resolution on climate change, on human rights, and so on. There are some country-based resolutions dedicated to specific countries. So we have this division. So if we talk about specific resolution, and this resolution on combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices, our country has been submitting this resolution since 2004 as part of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. And by the way, this is the predecessor of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the main intergovernmental human rights body of the United Nations system. Since 2005, this initiative was a topic of annual consideration by the UNGA. This is a topical resolution that is aimed at a dialogue, and it enjoys broad support by our partners. The text has no mentioning of any countries. It only highlights existing problems and challenges. It provides recommendations in order to address them, focusing on the development of international cooperation. In 2021, at the 76th session of the UNGA, this document was supported by 130 states. 49 countries abstained from voting, and the US and Ukraine stood against it. The resolution was co-sponsored by 58 states. The resolution is extremely topical and relevant amid the attempts to glorify Nazism and spread neo-Nazism, as well as racism and xenophobia. The document condemns such manifestations as a war on monuments to honor fighters against Nazism, whitewashing participants of Nazi movement and their henchmen, and the insignia that is associated with the victory over Nazism. On the 4th of November, New York hosted voting on the draft resolution of the 77th session of the UNGA on combating glorification of Nazism.
This draft, except for technical changes, repeats the document approved by the UN General Assembly on December the 16th, 2021, in terms of the L52 amendment thrown at the last moment, states that Russia is allegedly using the topic of combating the glorification of Nazism to justify its aggression against Ukraine. So its destructive nature is obvious, and the main purpose of the amendment is to politicize the topic of combating neo-Nazism, racism, and xenophobia. Unfortunately, this amendment was passed with 63 votes in favor, 23 against, and 65 abstentions. I beg your pardon, but if we, since 2005, have been advocating for this resolution, 17 years have passed, 17, 18 years have already passed, and all this time we have been justifying our aggression. Not really. There is logics instead. It is the very same question as of gas supplies. Do we really use gas supplies as an energy weapon? Not really. We have been supplying gas and energy resources. And right now, when they carry out terrorist attacks on gas pipelines, they ask us, what should they do with these energy supplies? It looks like nonsense. So I would like to note that the initiators of the amendment did not achieve their main goal. They failed to make an assessment of the resolution. So in conclusion, 105 states voted for the document, 52 delegations were against, and 15 countries abstained. And we would like to stress that Russia is always ready for dialogue and discussion of any constructive dialogues and ideas, but cannot agree to proposals affecting the substance and main thrust of the draft resolution. So it is fundamentally important for the co-authors of the initiative that this is a thematic resolution, not a country-specific resolution, and the problems identified in the documents are cross-border in its nature, and it affects the situation in the world. So if it is all, let's proceed to Media Alliance of Russian Communities. Are you with us? Yes, good day. The World Conference on Russian Compatriots Living Abroad has just ended on the sidelines, and during the conference the question was raised: where in the world can one get a classical Russian education after the closure of the Russian school in Prague? Which countries still have secondary schools at the Russian embassies in which our compatriots could receive Russian secondary education? Are there any schools in other countries, including unfriendly countries, where our compatriots could receive a Russian education? And it is a very interesting education that as a matter of concerns for our compatriots living abroad, on the 6th of October, we comment on it, and I would like to provide a site on this topic. So we believe that people can get a Russian education, Russian general education in the international educational schools, and the list of these educational schools can be found on a special website. So I'd like to say that back in 2015 we identified aims and tasks of the state policy of the Russian Federation in terms of general education in the Russian language abroad. Thus, the Russian schools acting abroad can be classified if they are specialized educational structures in Russian diplomatic missions that are created according to the agreements, according to the international Russian treaties, or according to the federal standard. And in terms of schools acting in the Russian diplomatic missions abroad, there are 82 schools. As a result of unfriendly actions of local authority schools in Latvia, Slovakia, Slovenia and the Czech Republic ceased its activities, and children who suffered from these decisions. So in schools of the Russian diplomatic missions, children of its diplomats, our compatriots and foreigners study there, and people who would like to receive a Russian education is entitled to submit an appeal to these schools, to these diplomatic missions, in order to receive a document about the Russian state education. I would like to remind you that we have federal portals such as the Russian education, the Russian digital school, and we will provide all the links. For example, a good project I have in mind, that is a project of the school of Primakov that not long ago was visited by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and we have amazing pictures of this visit. You can notice that the school of Primakov, the school named after Primakov, and the Arab countries, they cared a lot about these activities, about the establishment and the opening of the Russian school there. Thank you for your attention. So do you have other questions? If you have your questions,